I briefly touched on this before, but I wanted to cover this topic sufficiently in order to demystify it. We've seen a number of examples of our usage of the HTMLHelper method that had an overloaded version of the method that looks something like we can see in line number 30, where we have this odd little part of this little input parameter that has this odd nomenclature. We're basically creating a new anonymous object with a property called class set equal to text dash danger. And so if we were to hover our mouse cursor over it and look at IntelliSense and see what that is, and I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the right hand side, and I hover my mouse cursor over it again, you can see that it takes a object type that it's calling HTML attributes. Now the same thing is true then if we take a look at line number 19, this label for method. Again, we have another item. It's similar, but it has this prefix of HTML attributes colon. If we were to take a look at the IntelliSense, again I'm going to switch over here to the right hand side, you can see that it also is accepting an object type called HTML attributes. And then if we take a look at line number 29 in this case, the editor for method, we have yet another version of this object being passed in, another odd looking object. And if we were to hover our mouse cursor over that method, we would see that it's a little bit different. It has an object type that it's calling as an input parameter additional view data. So in each of these cases, we're setting an input parameter that renders the HTML that's emitted from the HTMLHelper method. However, these are three very different styles of sending in this additional information. And the larger question is, what is HTML attributes anyway? And finally, once we learn it, what can we do with it? How can we push that functionality to accomplish something that we want to accomplish? Sure, we can set the CSS class. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But and we can even use Bootstrap's classes for a responsive layout and sizing, but can we set other attributes of the emitted tags? So let's start with the basics. Most of the HTMLHelper methods that emit HTML will allow you to pass in HTML attributes, like we saw as we pointed these out in our create.cshtml page. Essentially, you can pass anything you want in there, even make up attributes if you want to, and those attributes will be added to the tag. So any tag, we're basically adding new attributes or properties onto that tag. Now, in most of these cases, we're setting the class of that particular tag that will be created, and we're setting it equal to some value. In this case, we would want it to text danger, which is a built-in Bootstrap class that will display it with some red styling, or depending on the Bootstrap template that we're using. So let's go ahead and push this just a little bit further. Let's find that in this editor 4 in line number 29, we can go ahead and, in addition to the class being set, I can also set the ID equal to, we'll call it price text box, like so. Okay? So setting the ID like we're doing right here could be useful if we plan on writing a lot of JavaScript and we want more control over things. Whenever you post the form, the MVC framework's model binding looks at the name attribute to match up HTML input controls to the model's properties. So you typically don't want to mess with the name attribute, but the ID attribute is something that we can definitely use and manipulate through JavaScript. So let's go ahead and run the application. I want to see where it puts this ID at. And we're on the create page. Let's go ahead and look at the source. And if we scroll down, we can find the input control for price. Here it is. And you can see that it spans onto another line, and we have our ID equal to price text box. What was the other attribute that was set there? Let's take a look at that real quick. So it should also be adding form control class as an attribute to our page as well. So let's take a look at that. And you can see that form control has been added as one of the several classes that's been added to this input control. Okay? So that's its purpose, so that you can add attributes onto existing tags whenever we add this HTML attributes object into our calls into HTMLHelper methods. So I believe the first one that we looked at was in line number 30. This was kind of the easiest way to create a new anonymous object and then add a property called class and set it equal to some value, in this case text-danger. And so this is fine in most situations. Near the end of this lesson, I'll show you an example of creating a generic dictionary of string and object. So dictionary, the T key would be string and the T value would be object. And you use that for passing attribute names and values in situations where you might be trying to use an attribute that has a dash, and we'll learn what the issue is there. So if you take a look in line number 29, let me go ahead and get rid of the webcam here. In line number 29, and for that matter, any of these calls, there is an @ symbol. So why do you need that @ symbol in front of the word class? We didn't use it when we added the ID attribute, right? So we need it because class is a reserved word in C#, and so you have to escape that keyword using Razor's @ symbol prefix. So that will escape it and say this is not a C# keyword. This is just something, an identifier we're going to use, an attribute, a property we're going to use that we're going to add on to our to the HTML tag that's emitted. Okay. Now if you take a look at line number 19, here we saw one of the different versions of this, how to call this, and notice that it added a named parameter called HTML attributes. So I believe they do this to make the code more obvious. There's no real benefit to adding this other than to make it self-documenting. Unfortunately, they didn't do that consistently. You see the many different ways in which they added these HTML attributes to the various calls into the HTMLHelper method. But again, it's not necessary, but it is helpful for somebody who's just learning HTML and they're looking at your code, or even to remind yourself what that's being used for. Now, another issue that you might run into is with HTML5's new data star attributes. So if you went through the HTML5 and CSS3 fundamentals course, you know that the data-star attributes are like metadata that are typically used by CSS or JavaScript for richer client-side functionality. So to illustrate the use of data star attributes, I'm going to add a Bootstrap plugin that can be activated in JavaScript. And so we're going to add the following script in the layout.cshtml file. And I'm just going to copy and paste this little call out in JavaScript. I'm going to put it right after the bootstrap.min.js script. That's where it's located, I believe. So here we're going to look for any items that have the data-toggle data star attribute. In this case, we made up the word toggle, or it's actually been made up for us in the bootstrap.js. Anytime that data toggle is set to tooltip, then we want to call the tooltip method, and I think again that's defined either in jQuery or in Bootstrap. So in the index.cshtml, what I'm going to do is paste in a line of code here after line number 10, where we have our create new action link method created. And so you can see that here we're going to add a create new link, and it's going to call the create action result method in the same controller, and then we're going to pass in this HTML attributes. We're creating a new anonymous object, and we're going to create a new property or attribute on that hyperlink called data-toggle equals tooltip, and then we're going to set data-placement, again another word that's made up that's going to be interpreted by the JavaScript libraries, that we want the tooltip on the right hand side, and then we're going to also set an attribute called title. That is an actual HTML5 attribute, and we're just going to say click here to create a new product, right? But you can see we're getting red squiggly lines here, and so this isn't going to work. And why doesn't it work? Well, here again, unfortunately, C# identifiers like variables and properties cannot contain dashes. So we have one or two choices here. What we can do is to actually change this from a dash to an underscore, like so, and that should fix it. So let's run the application and see that working. And now should be able to hover my mouse cursor here, and you can see that we get that that bootstrap tooltip. Click here to create a new product. That's pretty cool, right? Pretty easy to implement. So this is one way to do it, was to change out or change the name of those attributes, basically escaping them. The other thing that we can do is create a dictionary of t key string and t value object, like I referenced much earlier. So I'm going to paste in some more HTML. In fact, just to get rid of any doubt here, I'm going to add yet another line break. Whoops. There we go. And we're going to call this create new using dictionary of, well, I'm not going to go that far. Let's do that, and let's run that application. And just to show you how this works, that this too will give us the same effect, right? So essentially, in this case, if we take a look at the source code a little bit more in more depth, we're doing exactly what we're doing here, except we're creating a new object of type dictionary string object, and then inside of it we're going to create several string object pairs. So the string will be used as the name of the attribute that we're adding. So in this case, a data star attribute called toggle, and we're adding the object, which will be of type string, and setting it to tooltip. Again, data placement and setting its object to right, and then title and setting its object to click here to. So it's essentially identical. The only difference is that you see we didn't have to escape out the dash for an underscore. So it's a little bit more true to the actual attribute that we want to add to our HTML tag. All right. So let's take a look at one more example here. I'm going to look at edit.cshtml in line number 31 in this editor for price. Okay, and we take a look at this version and we hover our mouse cursor over to get the IntelliSense, and I'm going to change so that you can see off to the right hand side. You can see that that last parameter is not of type, well, it's of type object, but it's not called HTML attributes in the input parameter, you know, the name of that parameter. It's called additional view data. All right, so what's the difference? Well, this version of the overloaded method allows you to pass in additional view data. It just means, it's a means of passing that styling data into the editor template. So whenever you see that term additional view data, it's used actually in other places, and it's of type view data dictionary. So it's a container that's used to pass strongly typed data between a controller and a view. And we'll learn about the view data dictionary later on when we compare it to the view bag near the very end of this series. All right, so I recommend that if you ever forget this syntax or you're not really sure what to put in for the HTML attributes, simply use Bing to Google HTMLHelper class method to find some quick examples, or build a quick little app and let it generate out the scaffolded CRUD views, or just use the cheat sheet that we're building and we'll add to soon. So the important thing is not really the exact syntax, because unless you're working with this every day, you're probably going to forget it. You're likely to forget a curly brace or a comma or something like that. But instead, the important thing is the concept that you can modify attributes of HTML tags that are emitted by the HTML helper methods by by passing them as input parameters like we've done in this video, or we talked about in this video, and wrapping the attributes that you want to modify as anonymous objects, so passing them in like we've done here. Okay. All right, so hopefully that's helpful to at least understand what all that crazy code's doing. Now hopefully you should have a handle on it and why it does what it does. All right, great. We'll continue on in the next video. Thank you.